Good morning, everybody. We'll just give cyberspace a little bit of time to let people in. Great to see you all here. So we'll just give about 30 seconds more as cyberspace does its magic. I was going to say nice to see you all on a bright sunny day, but it isn't necessarily where I am, so I hope it's sunny where you are. Well, I'm going to kick off because I'm incredibly impatient and I can't actually wait 30 seconds. So thank you for joining us today for this Women's Sport Trust webinar. I'm Tammy Parler, the Chief Exec of the Women's Sport Trust, and I'll be your host this morning. For those who don't know, WST is a charity and our aim is to raise the visibility and increase the impact of women's sport. We're an independent voice in the industry, focusing on three areas: identifying and promoting a diverse range of role models, increasing the percentage and quality of media coverage, and finding ways to shift the funding landscape for women's sport. We publish these visibility reports regularly. This is actually the 16th time we have released our data, and I know it's made a massive difference. It's given a level of confidence and understanding to the industry that was really lacking. That role is still vital, so we're going to keep doing it. Ultimately, though, you're the ones out there in the industry doing the work, and you have one hell of a job. So I wanted to start by saying thank you. Thank you to all of you who are making women's sport more visible and giving it the platform that it really deserves. Now, this report covers January to May of this year, and there's lots that's been happening. It's been another record-breaking start to the year for women's sport, and lots of evidence that the global zeitgeist of women's sport shows no sign of slowing down. When Women's Sport Trust first started monitoring visibility, it was to provide much needed data to prove that not only does an audience for women's sport exist, but it's growing at an incredible rate. Now, we're in a new era of women's sport now, when data and insight need to get much more sophisticated. Our reports are not only a vital temperature check on the current state of women's sport visibility in the UK, but they should also stimulate your thinking and highlight key areas that need focus. Now, as usual, we've got lots to get through, so we need to go straight into the report. I'll be presenting some of the findings this morning, and we'll be joined by Shalina and Lizzie from Future Sport and Entertainment, who provide us with broadcast insight. We'll then end with a panel discussion and a chance to answer some of those questions that the report brings up, so please list those in the chat. Women's Sport Trust trustee Laura Weston will be monitoring that, and we all want to know what you think. And just to remind you as well that this is all downloadable from our website, and you'll get the link through your Eventbrite registration, and I'll post it.
I will never be able to get over
as well. So without any further ado, I'd now like to hand over to Shalina.
Thanks, Tammy. So for those that have maybe been on this presentation before, you might have seen this slide, but for those that haven't, we just wanted to give a quick definition slide. You'll obviously see the word women's sport throughout this report a lot, so wanted to highlight what that actually means. And so for us, that's basically any of the properties that we can easily identify as just the women's property. So things like Barclays WSL, women's cricket, women's Six Nations, and then same for the equivalent for men's. And then mixed sport is where we can't separate it out quite in that way. So things like tennis and the Olympics and those kind of properties. So to start, we're just going to take an overview of the first 5 months of the year. As Tammy mentioned, lots of records being broken. So it was the most watched first 5 months ever for women's sport in 2024. There were 22.6 million viewers on linear TV. You can see that's obviously slightly higher than the previous peak of 22 million last year. And then in particular, there's obviously been some strong growth in the last 3 years. Digging into this number a bit more, we wanted to break down the viewing hours and the coverage hours by free-to-air channels and pay TV. So viewing and coverage hours increased for free-to-air, and that was partly down to the successful Women's Six Nations, which we'll get into more detail later on. And then pay TV, as you can see, was actually down slightly, and that was primarily driven by the fact that in May, Jan to May last year, it was the ICC Women's T20 World Cup, which took place, but obviously there isn't an equivalent in this year. So without that tournament, the viewing hours and coverage hours went down. And then just digging into that pay TV decline in a bit more detail, we wanted to look at which properties had the largest decline in viewing hours on pay TV. And the first two there that you can see are because of a lack of 2024 editions taking place yet, whereas they did occur in 2023. So those there are kind of giving the biggest declines, and that the 2024 coverage is just highlights or tournament review and no actual live coverage. And then sticking with viewing hours, we wanted to see how it broke down by sport. So unsurprisingly, given the consistent free-to-air coverage, football's highest in both years. But there was a bit of a change in second place for 2024. So again, without the Cricket World Cup last year, Rugby Union came in second at 19th, whereas cricket then dropped to third at 6%. And then same concept here, but switching to coverage hours and then filtering on UK waking hours only, which we've defined as 8 a.m. to 11 p.m. And the reason for that is that we want to see what women's sport is airing during social times versus just in the middle of the night. Again, obviously, given the Cricket World Cup last year, that was particularly high. Football was second. But then without that, as you can see on the right-hand side, football's gone back up to first in 31%, followed by cricket then in 19%. And then finally, in the summary section, we wanted to see if the engagement has increased. So we looked at what proportion of the viewers have watched on more than one occasion. So the grey bars here are the 2024 numbers, and then the lines are the previous 3 years. So 58% of this year's 22.6 million viewers have watched on 2 or more occasions. So staying pretty consistent with 2023, which was at 57%. However, given the overall increase in viewers for this year, the actual number of people that 58% represents is the highest that we've seen so far at 13.2 million.
We're now going to delve into women's football. So starting with the Barclays Women's Super League, we've looked at various different metrics season on season over the past few years. Whilst the live game average, viewing hours and 3-minute reach metrics are down this season compared to last, the really positive story here is that the average minutes viewed per game is up season on season. So from that 36 minutes to 40 minutes. So fans are watching for longer on average per game. The audience is ever so slightly more female and younger this year, both up 1 percentage point from last season. We've also included a column here looking at the 23-24 season from the 4th of November, which is when coverage on Sky Showcase began. This is a channel that doesn't require a Sky Sports subscription, and historically there's been coverage from the start of the season. However, this year the coverage only started on the 4th of November. We can see that engagement is higher at 43 minutes when we slightly narrow the date range to account for the Sky Showcase coverage. We then wanted to look into these numbers a little deeper, so we've split out the data by channel. We can see that the live average audience and average minutes viewed per game is generally increasing across these main channels. The decreases we can see on BBC One and Sky Showcase are driven by fewer matches aired this season compared to last, with 3 fewer on BBC One and 9 fewer on Sky Showcase, which kind of explains why those live viewing hours and 3-minute reach metrics are down. Looking at demographics, Sky Sports channels are bringing in a younger, more female audience compared to last year. Here we've looked at the average game audience by channel over the past 2 seasons in a bit more detail. As mentioned on the prior slide, we can see the increases on BBC One and Sky Showcase. We can also see growth, just looking at the Sky Sports channels in a bit more detail, we've seen Sky Sports Premier League see a 68% increase in average audience for Barclays Women's Super League games season on season. Slight decreases on Main Event and Sky Sports Football, but that good increase on Sky Sports Premier League. We then wanted to zoom out a little bit and look at what other football properties these Barclays Women's Super League fans are watching. Here we're looking at various viewer overlaps between the Women's Super League, the Premier League, and the Lionesses fixtures. It's important to note that these are people who are watching for 3 minutes consecutively. There's quite a lot going on this slide, but we wanted to pull out a few key points. We can see that football fans vary significantly in their consumption habits of different properties, with all these different intersections having kind of fairly similar numbers. Secondly, more people watch the Premier League and at least one other women's football property than people who just watch the Premier League. So this is shown by That's 6.1 million viewers who just watch the Premier League compared to the 8 million, which is the overlap of that 3.5 and 1.5 million people, showing that there is definitely an appetite for women's football for Premier League fans. Thirdly, there's a higher overlap between the Premier League and the Women's Super League at 6.5 million, so that 3 and 3.5 million figures there, compared to the Premier League and Lionesses, which is 5 million. Finally, we just wanted to pull out a few demographic points. So only 39% of those who watch all three properties are female, compared to 50% who just watch the Premier League, 55 who just watch the Lionesses, and 51 who just watch the Women's Super League. The audience skews slightly older for the women's football properties compared to the Premier League. For those who watched the Super League only, 11% were aged between 16 and 34. This drops to 9% for the Lionesses, but rises to 30% for the Premier League. We then wanted to take a look at a kind of similar visualization, but here we've increased the reach threshold to 60 minutes compared to the 3 minutes we showed on the previous slide, to just kind of see the habits of the kind of more engaged fan. We can see that more engaged fans exhibit similar consumption habits. However, in contrast, we can see that the Premier League only group is by far the largest and takes up the largest proportion at 7.4 million compared to some of the other numbers on this slide. So still a bit of a way to go for women's football properties to reach the same kind of engagement levels as the Premier League. Changing focus slightly, we wanted to move on to look at the impact of time slot on broadcast performance. Here we have the average audience by time slot for Women's Super League games on BBC this season compared to the time slot average. Despite the Women's Super League average being lower kind of across the board than the time slot average, we saw that generally early afternoon performed best. So this Saturday at 12:30, Sunday 12:15 and Sunday 12:30. We then kind of had a look at a similar charts, but for Sky Sport channels. This tells us a bit of a different story, with the time slot performance heavily dictated by the men's football schedule. So the Sunday 4:30 p.m. games, which is a typical Premier League time slot, performed poorly against the time slot average. However, the other time slots on Sky Sport Premier League and Sky Sport Football were higher than the time slot average at, for example, Sunday 6:45 and Friday evening. We also wanted to take a look at the year-on-year performance of the Women's Football Show, which is the BBC WSL highlight show. We've seen an increase in coverage hours over the past 2 seasons, as well as steady year-on-year growth for viewing hours. This season, the Women's Football Show received 5.9 million viewing hours, which is equivalent to 16% of the Barclays Women's Super League viewing hours. It's worth noting here that BBC iPlayer isn't included, and given the typical kind of Sunday night time slot, we'd expect this to contribute significantly to the audience.
So we then looked at the proportion of viewers for the Barclays WSL and the Premier League by region, and wanted to kind of see where they might differ from one another the most. So the lines in this chart are the proportion per property, and then the bars that you can see are whether the Barclays WSL under or over index compared to the Premier League. So in terms of the under indexing side, the North of England, which has 6 Premier League clubs, was where the Barclays WSL under indexed the most. And then on the flip side, if you look to the right, you can see that actually over indexed the most in the Midlands, West and Yorkshire. Interestingly, London actually had the exact same proportion for both properties, so that 18% there in the middle, despite 4 fewer Barclays WSL clubs in London than in the Premier League. I guess it's worth noting that obviously the total number of teams in both of those leagues are different. So while that's only obviously half of the Premier League clubs there, the proportion is actually a bit higher. And then the next few slides are going to look at the data by team. So starting with cumulative reach by Barclays WSL club over the last 3 seasons, we found that the top clubs generally closely follows league position. So you can see at the bottom there, we've got who finished 1st through 4th in the league each of those seasons. And you can see that kind of generally the most watched teams are the ones that are finishing top, and then therefore getting more coverage and more exposure. And then we wanted to take a look at how that is for some men's properties. So starting with Premiership Rugby, 100 and Premier League. So obviously Premier League in the football side of things, but Premiership Rugby and 100 having some free-to-air coverage as well, mirroring the rights deal for the Barclays WSL. The ratio from top to bottom for the Barclays WSL was 9.2. And then on the right there, we've just called out kind of how it compares to these men's properties. So kind of sits roughly in the middle. Premiership rugby there is highest with 13.6, but men's 100 is actually lowest with 2.4. And then sticking with the team breakdown, but now switching to average audience per team. And we wanted to split that out by BBC and Sky. So starting on the left with the BBC numbers, you can see that the top 6 teams there, they all had BBC One coverage for at least one of their games. And then the bottom teams didn't, so they either aired on BBC Two or BBC Four. I guess it's interesting to note the Spurs numbers though. So they're obviously quite high in terms of average audience, but didn't have any games on BBC One. And the reason for that is because they had their games against Arsenal and Chelsea, so that drove up the audience there. On the right-hand side, on the Sky figures, you can see that it's kind of a bit more consistency across all of the teams. But again, kind of a similar story to BBC, where Leicester were actually top, despite only being shown twice. But that's because those 2 games were against Arsenal and Chelsea. And then similarly to Reach, average audience across all the coverage kind of mirrors the same. So top of the table teams airing more times, having more of an average audience. But something that's really positive to note here as well is you can see that the average audience in terms of the most watched team has kind of slowly been growing over these last couple of seasons. Bit consistent over the last 2, but at the highest at 348,000. And then just comparing that to the Premier League again, sort of same case where the top clubs are kind of near the top. But generally you can see that Manchester United is pretty good, kind of aired quite a lot of times and top in both Premier League and Barclays WSL. And then finally on Barclays WSL audiences, we just wanted to show kind of how they span across the whole season. So I guess similar to what we showed before with the teams, you can see that any coverage of BBC One and then BBC Two is kind of generally highest. There's that obviously one outlier there with the grey bar kind of near the front. And that's actually the Manchester Derby on Sky, which was obviously the most watched Sky game there. But then actually, if you look at the most watched game in total, it's also the Manchester Derby. That was on BBC. So something very interesting to be said about potentially some of those rivalries transferring over to the Barclays WSL. When we look at the most watched game from last season, it was also a rivalry, the North London Derby, but the average audience was a bit lower at 762,000 compared to 813 this year. And then moving away from audiences and looking at player TV news and press mentions. So again, just from the same time period of Jan to May. And I guess as you'd expect, the majority of the mentions are for the English players, but then some of the other countries they're listed are because they've got some key players from those markets. Again, similarly to audiences, the top teams kind of garner the highest number of mentions, and that's partly driven by more mentions for players that have a high number of goals and assists. And then on the bottom left, we wanted to look at the mentions by week, just as the season progresses. You can see there are some clear spikes kind of near the end of the season as they kind of come to the end. So domestic finals taking place. And then also when the Lionesses played some European qualifiers, that also drove a spike in mentions. And then just looking at it from the most mentioned players from this time period, I think it's interesting to note that Lauren James has gone from 4th last year to 1st this year. And then generally the most mentioned players were kind of all from the same sort of similar top 4 clubs, with the exception there being Aston Villa's Rachel Daly. And then just a quick note on attendances. It's been a really strong start for football in 2024. We've obviously listed out a few of the Barclays WSL records that were broken this year that have been really widely reported. But then also wanted to highlight a couple others, like Chelsea women selling out Stamford Bridge for the UEFA Women's Champions League semi-final against Barcelona. And then also the cumulative attendance across the Barclays WSL and the Barclays Women's Championship past 1 million people prior to the end of the season. So yeah, a very strong start, and kind of hopefully that will continue. And then just moving away from Barclays WSL to the Women's FA Cup. And so looking at the tournaments over the last 3 years, the non-final average has increased each year. So it's 462,000 in 2022, up to 537,000 this year. In terms of the final itself, the audience was a bit lower this year than what we'd seen over previous years. So not quite breaking that 1 million average audience threshold there. It's potentially down to, I guess, the caliber of Man U's opponent this year versus last year, and kind of the one-sided nature of the game. And then finally on football, we want to see how the Lionesses have fared since the World Cup. So prior to the tournament in 2023, the average audience for their games was just under 1 million, so at 911,000. And then obviously after the World Cup and its success there, the average audience actually increased slightly to 1.1 million. There is a bit of a range in terms of the actual audiences for the different games, but that's partly based on the channel they aired on, so whether they're on BBC One and ITV1 or on ITV4. And then also partly due to the opponent as well. So some of those home nations games against Scotland doing particularly well.
Zone's YouTube viewership on their women's football channel, mostly driven by the UEFA Women's Champions League, remained relatively static year on year, despite having reduced the amount of live Premier football available on their YouTube channel to launch an on-platform free offering in January. The WSL saw a significant rise in TikTok views, rising from 92 to 147 million last season. Not only did views of the league's official channel increase, but the conversation around the league also increased. Videos using the Barclays WSL hashtag saw a more than threefold increase, and their engagement rate rose too. Looking at the TikTok conversation, we focused on video views connected to the most commonly used hashtags. Chelsea were the most mentioned team in relation to the posts using the Barclays WSL hashtag. And for WOSO, a commonly used hashtag around the women's football community, it was Arsenal-related accounts that were tagged most often, including the club account and players such as Russo and Mead. Overall, we see TikTok continuing to be a platform that rights holders are using, both in reaching existing fans of women's sport, but also engaging younger audiences new to the sport on the platform. We benchmarked leading women's sport competitions, and you can see that despite a fall in views, the Women's Six Nations is still getting huge value from its ongoing partnership with TikTok. WNBA has overtaken the WSL in views, but the growth shown for the WSL suggests it still remains a vital platform for the league. We like to test out assumptions, and one of those is that many refer to TikTok as a platform solely for very short-form video clips. Now, when we looked at the data using access to Tubular Labs, we unearthed some interesting results. Videos that are over 1 minute are actually performing best for the WSL, which again is in contrast to the Premier League, where the under 30-second videos delivered higher views. We then compared data from 4 WSL and 4 Premier League teams. We see that videos longer than 30 seconds performed best for the WSL, yet they made up a small percentage of overall posts, which again is in contrast to Premier League clubs. Now, the number of views a video achieves obviously depends on a lot of factors: who's on it, the quality of the content, whether it's newsworthy, culturally relevant, the optimization for the platform, and a whole lot more. So we're not saying that you shouldn't be posting under 30-second videos in women's sport, but I guess we want to underline how important it is to use data to inform what content works best for the audiences that we're trying to serve. And the likelihood is that it's going to be different for men's and women's sport. But beyond the WSL, one team that has done particularly well on TikTok this year is Barcelona. We've seen them combining content that celebrates on-field brilliance with content that taps into cultural talking points around music, entertainment, and fashion. This helped them almost quadruple their TikTok views across the season. Now, we all know the importance of female athletes in driving social media growth, and sometimes a female athlete can achieve more success than the teams they represent. Aston Villa's Alicia Lehman averaged 4.8 million views per video on TikTok. In total, she achieved a staggering 455 million TikTok views across the season, and only 6 Premier League clubs had more TikTok views than her last season. Manchester United and England goalkeeper Mary Earps averaged almost 1.5 million TikTok views per video, while her club colleague Ella Toone averaged just under 1 million. Her club, the only WSL team with more than 1 million followers on TikTok, averaged 0.14 million views per post. Overall, Arsenal women were the best performing WSL club on TikTok in the 23-24 season, achieving 83 million video views. Leading women's teams have also begun to develop sizable followings for individual players on Instagram. When we looked at the Lionesses squad, players averaged almost 450,000 followers. Now, put that in context, this is well behind England men's football and cricket teams, but it is 4 times that of the average England men's rugby union team. Some WSL teams, such as Chelsea and Arsenal, also have higher individual followings than even some mid-table Premier League clubs, such as Crystal Palace. It's also not just on TikTok that WSL teams are achieving success. Only 7 Premier League clubs have more Instagram followers than Chelsea women, and video engagements on Instagram were over 5 times that of any Premiership rugby team and 13 times more than any team in the 100. Here we see the growth in Instagram video engagements from those big international domestic leagues such as the WNBA and the WPL. WSL saw a fall, but it's important to note that it's still higher than notable men's leagues in the UK, such as the EFL, Premiership Rugby, and the 100. When it comes to women's sport at a league level, the WNBA has been one of the talking points globally. We've seen positive stories around start of season attendance and viewership. Their social channels got 157 million video views through the first week of the season. WNBA store transactions up 756%. WNBA app monthly active users was up 613%. The chart here shows an incredible rise in TikTok views at the start of the season, although for context, it's worth noting that the FIFA Women's World Cup account achieved 430 million views in August last year. But the graph does show this increased focus. Deep diving into some of the WNBA platform and lessons to learn. On TikTok, 7 videos achieved more than 2 million views in May rather than one single video, driving huge video views while they dramatically increased the volume of uploads. On Instagram, 4 of the top 5 posts in terms of video engagements were collab posts with the NBA, which helped drive record-breaking engagement. And on YouTube, the WNBA achieved 7.45 million views in May, another record. And the top 6 videos in May were all Indian Fever highlights, with viewers catching up on Caitlin Clark's matches.
We're now going to take a look at the Women's Six Nations. So here we've looked at the coverage hours, viewing hours, and 3-minute reach for the Women's Six Nations from 2017 to this year. There's a strong upwards trajectory for viewing hours and 3-minute reach, with 2024 at the highest year on record for both metrics at 13.5 million viewing hours and 8.1 million people watching for 3 minutes or longer. We've also included the Men's Six Nations 3-minute reach on the right, and we can see this has been kind of more or less in decline since 2017, a stark contrast to the women's property. We've then looked at the live average audience for England fixtures since 2021. So the 2024 England game average is 42% higher than in the previous year, with 808,000 people watching on average across the live fixtures, up from 570,000 last year. The England versus France final match received an impressive 1.3 million in average audience. The Grand Slam was on the line, with both teams going unbeaten into that final match. And this and BBC One coverage helped drive a strong audience. In 2024, generally matches later in the afternoon have performed better, with the 3 p.m. and 4:45 p.m. time slots performing better than that 2:15 time slot. We then wanted to delve a little deeper into what these fans look like and the overlap between fans watching the Women's Six Nations, Men's Six Nations, or both. Looking at the table at the top, we've seen that in 2024, 2.4 million people watched the women's only property, which was 28% of the total. 7.4 million watched both properties, and then 18.4 million people watched the men's only property. We can see that there's been year-on-year growth for the Women's Six Nations, with more people watching either the women's only or both this year compared to last year. However, 71% of Men's Six Nations viewers still don't watch the women's version. Looking at the fan demographics at the bottom of the slide, we can see that the women's only viewers are becoming slightly more female, now at 50% for this year. The age, income, and whether they have children in the household remain more or less consistent year on year. Looking at the men's Six Nations only viewers, we can see they're skewing younger and are more likely to have children in their household compared to last year, and also compared to the women's only viewers. We wanted to broaden our view slightly to include the viewer overlap with the men's Rugby World Cup, which happened towards the end of last year. We can see that there is less variation in rugby fan consumption habits compared to those of football fans that we touched on earlier in the presentation, with the majority of viewers watching only the men's properties. This presents an opportunity for the Women's Six Nations to grow their viewership by tapping into those people that currently only watch the men's rugby union properties. The overlap between the two Six Nations properties is higher at 2.2 million than the Women's Six Nations and the Rugby World Cup overlap at 0.8 million, implying Women's Six Nations fans are more likely to be fans of the Six Nations as a whole rather than the Men's Rugby World Cup. Focusing back on the Women's Six Nations, we had a look at the matches which received the highest peak viewership kind of over the past few years. The top 3 most watched matches on record are from the 2024 tournament, with a further 3 matches from 2024 making it into this top 12. The most watched match was England-France fixture that we spoke about before, so the Grand Slam winning match, again showing that kind of championship fixtures as well as BBC One coverage helps drive viewership. Across these 12 most watched matches, the average minutes viewed in 2024 was 55 minutes, similar to that 57 minutes last year, but up from the 48 minutes in 2022. In comparison, this was 75 minutes for men's Six Nations England matches. We then wanted to look at who these fans are that watch the Women's Six Nations and how that has changed from last year. We can see that there was a slight decline in female audiences, so going from 42 to 39% this year. A greater proportion of the audience was over 55 years old, so 76% versus 70% last year. However, social class and presence of children in the household remained broadly similar year on year. We then wanted to look at how the Women's Six Nations fan demographics differed to that of the men's. We can see that the Women's Six Nations attracted a slightly older profile of fan, with 76% compared to the 63% from the men's property. They were also less likely to have children in the household and were slightly more male, at 61% versus 59%. Finally, we wanted to benchmark how the Women's Six Nations average audience compares to that of other women's sport properties. Whilst football properties still dominate, the Women's Six Nations England game average was 3rd, only behind Lionesses games and ahead of the Women's FA Cup and Barclays Women's Super League. Excluding football, the Women's Six Nations average audience across all games is higher than that of any other sport properties. Women's sport properties, I should say.
Great. So now we're going to take a look at some additional events, and starting with tennis. So for ATP and WTA only tournaments, we've listed them separately, and then ones that kind of have both, so things like the Grand Slams or like Indian Wells and Miami Open, those are listed as both. Obviously, since this coverage is new on Sky this year, we wanted to delve into it a little bit. And so on the left-hand side, we've got viewing and coverage hours across all tennis on TV so far in 2024. So you can see there that the both categories obviously significantly higher than ATP only or WTA only. Partly that's driven by the fact that that includes the Australian Open and the first week of the French Open, with obviously those Grand Slams garnering a high amount of attention and audiences. And then on the right-hand side, we wanted to look at viewing hours by the top 3 Sky channels. So Sky Sports Tennis, as you'd probably expect, is highest there, obviously with the dedicated coverage. But then when you look at Sky Sports Main Event, that's kind of where it gets a bit interesting. So looking at kind of just the ATP and the WTA only ones, the viewing hours are actually very similar. So 772,000 for ATP versus 737,000 for WTA. But then when you look at the table on the left there, you can see that the coverage hours for WTA was actually significantly lower. So gaining kind of the same number of viewers, but from significantly less coverage, which is obviously very positive. And then given that this Sky coverage is new this year, we wanted to see how those viewers are interacting with women's sport. Are they kind of already watching it, or is it new to them? So of the 5.3 million people that have watched tennis coverage on Sky so far in 2024, we then took an overlap with that to just everybody that watched women's sport last year, which was at 37.8 million. And so that overlap there is 3.2 million people that watched both, which then results in 2.1 million people that had watched tennis on Sky this year, but hadn't watched any women's sport last year. So then taking that group and then looking at the demos on the right-hand side, we wanted to kind of learn a bit more about who are these people and how could we reach them and contact them. So in terms of that, we've taken women's sport viewers from last year, obviously these tennis Sky viewers this year, people that watched tennis this year but no women's sport last year. And then finally, we've taken that one step further and said, so that group that didn't watch women's sport last year but have watched tennis so far this year, have they then gone on to watch any women's sport this year? Which kind of positively is almost all of them at 1.9 million. So hopefully that kind of new Sky coverage is making people then kind of go on and watch the more women's sport. In terms of those demographics, they're kind of fairly similar with a few changes that I wanted to call out. People that had just watched women's sport generally last year tend to be a little bit less upmarket, and then also a bit more female, which kind of makes sense given that obviously there's a lot of free-to-air coverage for women's sport, which might lend itself then to a more female, slightly less upmarket viewer. But generally, in terms of children, household and age, it's pretty consistent across all four of those groups. And then looking at the Rugby League Challenge Cup final now, so the men's and women's finals have taken place on the same day for the second consecutive year. So the 3-minute reach for women's final this year reached almost 1 million viewers, so 930,000. In terms of the average audience there, you can see that it's 241,000, and that's actually pretty significantly up on last year's 154,000. But it's worth noting that last year's game clashed with the Women's World Cup game between England and Colombia, so that obviously had quite a big impact on the overall audiences. And while the average audience for the women's game has kind of been generally on the up, the men's final audience actually dropped slightly this year. So the numbers themselves are obviously higher than what the women's are getting, and they air on BBC One, but there's been a decline year over year. So 2023 men's final had 808,000 viewers on average versus 758 this year. And then on the right-hand side, we wanted to have a look a bit whether that back-to-back scheduling is beneficial and kind of driving more people to the women's game. So of the 3.3 million people that had watched the men's final on BBC One this year, 19% had also gone on to watch the women's final that aired directly before on BBC Two. Just comparing that to previous years, it was 13% last year. But then when you look at the years where the finals weren't consecutive, so they were held on completely different days, you can see that the overlap is much lower. So 7% in 2021 and 9% in 2022.
We've also had a look at the average audience for the boat race on BBC One from 2015 to this year, and how the women's race audience compares to that of the men's. The women's race has historically received a lower average audience than the men's race. This year, the women's race received a 1.8 million average audience, 30% lower than the men's race and 23% lower than the 2023 event. Since the pandemic, the audience for both races has yet to kind of recover to pre-pandemic levels. However, the difference between the men's and women's has remained mostly consistent over the past few years. Moving on to the World Athletics Indoor Championships, we've looked at the viewing hours from 2014 up to the most recent competition held in Glasgow earlier this year. All competitions receive coverage on the BBC, and we can see that the championships held in the home nations received the highest viewing hours, driven by kind of local interest and good time zones for live viewing. Finally, we wanted to take a look at netball. So here we've split it out into two main properties: the Domestic Netball Super League and the International Nations Cup, or Quad Series as it was called in 2023. We've seen year-on-year audience growth for the 2024 Nations Cup compared to the 2023 version, with all coverage on Sky Sport Mix and Sky Sport Arena for this year. The 2024 tournament was held in England, whereas the 2023 version was in South Africa. So local interest a contributing factor this year, but favourable time zones for both tournaments. The Domestic Netball Super League tells a bit of a different story. with a year-on-year decline in viewing hours from 504 to 35. However, there are a few kind of nuances to be aware of here. Coverage of the 28 matches in 2023 were on linear Sky Sport channels, whereas this year, only the first 5 matches of the season were on Sky Sports. The other 15 matches were aired on BBC Red Button and received much lower audiences. It's also important to note that this season is still ongoing with the final this weekend, and this data is only captured up to the 1st of June. Outside of linear TV, YouTube is the main platform for watching live netball. So here we've looked at the YouTube views, the coverage hours, and the views per programme for both properties year on year. The story for Netball Super League is quite different to that of linear TV, with year-on-year growth in views per programme increasing from 22.5 thousand to 29,000 for this year, despite a decrease in overall coverage. This shows that when the option is available, people are engaging with live netball coverage via the YouTube platform. Again, worth noting that the Super League season is still ongoing, and this data doesn't include the semi-finals or final. However, in 2023, it was slightly earlier, so those numbers do include the semi-final and final, which received the highest of the season. On the other hand, we can see that the Nations Cup has performed very similarly year on year, with consistency kind of across all metrics. Finally, we wanted to pull out 3 kind of major broadcast headlines from everything we've spoken through today. So firstly, it was the most watched January to May ever for women's sport in 2024, with 22.6 million viewers reached. Secondly, the Barclays Women's Super League 23-24 season total audience was slightly down from last season, but engagement increased from 36 to 40 minutes per game. Last but not least, it was the most viewed Women's Six Nations on record, with 8.1 million viewers reached across all games.
Right, so we know there's a lot in this deck. There's a lot in this deck to take away and sort of digest and to try to understand what that means for your particular role or for your particular organisation. So we wanted to point to a few things that we think are key takeaways. They're probably also the big challenges that we're facing. So it would be good to get your take on things too. At a league level, there's a big question around how to balance exposure across the league. Top teams may drive more audiences, which is important when competing against many other entertainment properties, but clubs across the league also need exposure. Women's sport isn't one homogenous group, and our marketing strategies need to reflect that. There isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's not about separating properties or keeping together. Perhaps flexible short-form rights can help provide content in the format that fans want to watch. But providing the level of content needed to deliver those personalised strategies is going to take a lot more investment. For broadcasters, well, prominence matters, as does signposting. Your content needs to be where the audience exists. Make sure that we're not just making this all about football. There are loads of very exciting properties out there, and we need to look at developing our customer retention strategies, looking at viewing patterns and time spent watching. And finally, for clubs, we'd like to say, if you're not understanding your data, you need to get up to speed. Focus on building club and player profile with content that's relevant and tapping into that creator community out there. We all have a role to play in growing every aspect of the ecosystem. Cross-promotion is essential. So think not just about building attendance, but also what you can do around broadcast viewership. So we're building this whole pie together. Laura, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Right, we're just going to go through some questions if that's all right. Think they're all going to be all right, not too scary, but we'll give it a go. Oh, I just lost my, hold on, lost that. Right, so number 1, I think, well, thank you for everyone's positive comments, by the way. That's always a nice thing to hear. Marvellous. Let's have a little think. Right, so the first one, Shalina, is about viewship. Does it take into account out-of-home viewing? So we're seeing lots of increases in collectives hosting watch parties and events for WSL. I can concur with this because I was speaking to Gawler FC this week, and they do their watch parties Friday for the WSL, and so there's a lot more of that, people coming together to watch WSL. So is that taken into account?
So the numbers in this report are just linear TV. So it doesn't take into account out of home and doesn't take into account people watching on digital. So yeah, I guess there's obviously a big proportion of people that are doing that, as you mentioned, and kind of are a big part of, I guess, the overall consumption and engagement with women's sports. So yeah, definitely something that hopefully we could kind of tap into a bit more and kind of figure out a way to include in these presentations. But yeah, as of now, it's just the linear TV, aside from the digital metrics that Tammy went over.
I'd say I'd add to that there's lots of these reports have developed so much over the past sort of 3 years that we've been doing them, and each time they bring up new questions. And yes, or the amount of people watching in pubs or watch parties and all sorts, and we're constantly trying to find ways to capture all that data so we can give the industry a proper view on what's happening. I think it's important that we have consistent metrics so we can see that rise over time. But we're looking for partnership with a pub chain that could give us information. Anything out there. If you from so many different organizations here, if you have data that's and information that would help the whole industry grow, please get in touch, because it would really benefit everybody.
Definitely. And I would just say that the other thing to take from that question is just that's an opportunity really around watch parties and the collective and connecting with communities and bringing people together. That's what I think I've seen in the last 6 months around women's sport, is that need for community and connection. So the more that we can create those opportunities for people to come together, the better, really. Right, I think this is semi-technical. I think it's fine, Shalene. I'll just say it word for word. Can I ask if the increase in viewing on non-mainstream / linear TV, i.e. on Sky Sports, is a free offer or pay-per-view? Do you have that data?
Yes, it kind of depends. I guess there's different ways of Sky Sports channels being available to different people. So I think, as Lucy mentioned, some of those Sky channels, like Sky Sports Mix and then Sky Max and Sky Showcase, are available to people who just have a Sky subscription. You don't have to have a specific sports subscription. And then the Sky Sports remaining channels are ones where you do need to have a Sky Sports subscription to be able to view those. So that's what we've included in ours. There is obviously Sky Sports Box Office and things like that, which there haven't been any properties that I guess we've needed to look at that channel for. So haven't included any of that. But yeah, there's obviously different levels of access to Sky Sports. And so that would then, I guess, in turn limit the viewership potentially.
And an easy one. Could you explain the 3-minute metric again? Sorry. No worry, because every time we get confused.
Yeah, no apology necessary. Yeah, so 3-minute reach is basically anybody that watched at least 3 minutes of that program. So they were exposed to it for 3 minutes at least, and then can obviously go on for however long program is. So you can do different reach thresholds. We did the overlap side with 60 minutes just to show a bit more of an engaged viewer, but 3 minutes is generally the industry standard.
Can I just jump in there, Laura? Because the question, please don't apologise for asking questions like that. But we're all learning. It's sort of this is all new stuff to us, and it's a big thing is at the moment we seem to be getting inundated by data. We need more data, but we're also getting inundated by data. And what does it all mean? And what's the most important? And what am I getting and what am I not getting? And how should I use it? If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed at times and that you don't know what to be looking at and things, that's keep asking those questions, and we'll keep doing our best to try and explain things. But you're also not alone as far as trying to get your head around how to use this and build impact and viewership.
Here. Okay. Could we have more information or thoughts behind women's viewership age being higher than men's? Is that, Shalina, more to do with, I don't know, I think if you balance that with the digital data and TikTok and all we're seeing on there, it kind of starts to paint a little bit of a picture of the traditional channels being slightly older. I always view women's sport as being almost like the future of sport. It's like how sport's actually going to be for men's sport. So I think that's probably a bit of an insight, but what do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's spot on. I think we'd previously looked at like the netball demos when it's on TV versus on YouTube and saw a big difference there. So I do think it is partly a linear TV thing, and obviously we know that generally younger people are watching less linear TV, but supplementing that with other types of content and media. So yeah, I think your point is spot on there.
It's hard to always I mean, we never really like to compare with the Premier League because it's a sort of blessing and a curse in some ways, isn't it? It has got a younger audience because continue to have a younger audience. Were those time slot average metrics comparing the women's game to any content on the channel or to Premier League games?
That's to any content on the channel. So just kind of your average show that might be on that. If they weren't going to show the women's sport property, what might they have showed instead, and what would that audience have gotten depending on what they normally show? Brilliant.
Data on demographics of people who attend women's games versus men's to see how different the profile is. We haven't really got to this. I mean, I don't think all the clubs have necessarily got to this data yet in terms of attendance. It seems to be one of those things that people are kind of desperately trying to find out at the moment. And I think this particular webinar is more about visibility. We put some attendance data in there just as a sort of point of reference, but we haven't deep dived into that. So I think we'll leave that one for now.
Can I comment on that though, Laura? Because you and I have this sort of discussion a little bit about demographics are really important. They give us so much information, but they don't tell us everything. And there's something around how context changes behaviour as well. Laura, you often you're a big Liverpool fan, and you talk about how your behaviour is different when you're watching a men's match and a women's match. So there's something that we need to understand more around, but how context influences fandom or attendance and viewership, and the behaviours that are sort of coming out a little bit more that we're still trying to get to grips with.
Yeah, you see your age and social class is only going to tell you so much, I suppose, and it's more about attitudinal and also propensity to sort of that sort of change in behaviour when you're at games is important because, for example, you might be more open to buying merchandise, or you might be, spending more on food and drink, or you might be spending more time at the game versus less. It depends. My thing is always that when I go to Anfield, I've been going there for 30 years. I have a very set way of doing it. So, and it actually doesn't involve going to the shop or actually having much food or drink. I just go to my seat, watch the game and go. Whereas with the women's game, I will go earlier. I will probably take my kids. I will be absolutely up for shopping and buying all the merchandise, and that's just one example of how I behave. But I think, getting into that detail and understanding people's attitude, as Tammy said, is really important because it's especially commercially to understand the potential to spend more money. Joe Bostock, wow, that's a name that we all love. Do you have any data on player mentions being positive or negative? Lauren James, for example, has had some pretty harsh coverage, yes, especially on social media. We haven't got that data, have we, Shalina, really, in terms of the positive or negative, really?
No,
it's something that we want to tap into more. I love a co-founder coming back on and putting a question in. Really good to see you. We need to, it's something that I very much want to delve into more about the how of visibility. So not just about quantity, we also need to look at prominence, but also looking at tone and, all those sorts of things. So we're working on trying to understand that a little bit more. But as all these things, more work to be done. Shalina, I think I cut you off.
It's a blessing and a curse, isn't it? I was just going to say about, have someone who who launched the WSL in terms of PR terms. I spent so much time trying to get people to pay attention to the WSL and no one would. Now Lauren James unfollows Mary Earps on Instagram and it becomes a national news story. So, you sort of be careful what you wish for in some ways, I suppose. But, it's great that that's so relevant that people have got to cover it and it becomes a sort of a news story. So sorry, Shalina, we're going to add some more on that.
No, I was just going to say, I think sentiment analysis is really interesting. And I think just from a personal perspective, just from reading stories, I think maybe previously there was kind of a shift of not trying to say anything too negative or only kind of saying positive things about women's sport. And I think that the sentiment part of it is really interesting because I do think you obviously don't see that in the men's sport. And so it's definitely an interesting, analysis to see of we want the visibility, but then also what does that actually mean and look like? And are we treating it fairly and not just kind of giving it the attention for just the sake of it and only being positive and kind of ignoring parts of it?
Yeah. Julie, I'm just going to answer your question quickly around do you have this data in the format for other sports to see how they stack up versus women's football? We haven't, as Tammy mentioned, but there's only so much, unfortunately, we can do at the moment. So we haven't got it for everything, but that's always the ambition. If anybody has any fun, many thanks.
And our reports focus on different things at different times. So we're monitoring quarterly. We do an end of year report, and you know, this report coincides a little bit with the end of the season for the WSL. So, and the Six Nations have just happened, so naturally takes a focus. We're going to be, our next report that will come out will be at the end of summer. We'll have just had the Olympics and Paralympics, so I'd imagine that'll be a big focus. So we do alter things a little bit depending on what's happened within that last quarter.
This is a really interesting question, and something that I definitely pulled out of this report. Would you say if, for example, Bristol City women were given more game time slots as much as Chelsea women on TV, it would increase their reach and therefore predict to show them mid-graph, and do the same for all mid-low table women's WSL clubs? And that will start to shift that pattern of viewers / reach following league position.
Gosh, that's a $6 million question, isn't it? That absolutely, you need to raise visibility in order to increase interest. I mean, that's one of our key, you know, visibility will drive engagement. But there are also many factors in play, from, you know, from jeopardy and connection and you know, so it's not a given that it would happen. Shalina, you've unmuted. What's your thought?
No, I was going to say, I think it's interesting. I guess we've had conversations separately around like the Women's FA Cup final, in terms of it being sold out, but then it actually not breaking the attendance record the way it did last year. And like even with the linear TV audience, like it not being as high as last year, partly maybe down to the caliber of the teams. So I think it's an interesting, I think your point, Tam, is correct in that, yeah, I think it's something that is good and needed, but isn't the only thing that would help it. I think there does need to be a little bit more into it. I'm not sure exactly what that is, but
you can't just put it on and expect people to watch it. So you have to drive interest.
Yeah.
But if it's not there, people can't see it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation. We need to get so much better at understanding our data, signposting content, cross-promoting, building up clubs and player profile. There's so many other things that actually need to work in tandem. But yes, if it's not there, you're not going to see it.
Exactly. Right, I've got 2 minutes. So I just wanted to get to a netball question. I think netball is really interesting when you look at those figures, and also the announcement of the new Super League and what the implications are. But I had a netball question and I can't find it. Here it is. Right, I'm interested in football. This is from Julie, but want to know what your view is on how netball can make the sport as consumable as football. Listening to this, do you think that the free view content is what is driving the uplifts versus linear TV and key to growing fan base? The new Super League has aspirations to fill arenas, but the current data shows a bit of a gap to shift towards a 5,000 seats for a domestic Super League game.
I don't know if Sky are on at the moment. Shalina, do you have a thought there?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of relates to what you were just saying around like the visibility side of it. I do think one of the things that football has done well is done that visibility in terms of the free-to-air side of things, but then also signposting to Sky Sports or PTV when needed. I think when the England Jamaica series was on free-to-air for netball, it did particularly well, and we did see a bit of an increase in Super League viewership and kind of people moving between the two properties. Obviously, that's just one approach. It doesn't have, that might not necessarily work for everyone, but I guess in terms of that visibility side of things, I think that has been particularly good. But then we have seen, obviously, the YouTube figures are positive and kind of going up. So it might be that, kind of similar to what you were saying before, Laura, that netball is a property that's just viewed slightly differently to some of the other properties that might have been historically more linear TV, whereas netball might have a chance to focus more on that digital side of things, and that's kind of where they build.
I think to that point of filling 5,000 arenas, I know when you go through that process of creating a new league, obviously there's loads of things that you have to answer to say that you're going to commit to, and one of those is often marketing budget and, you know, obviously bringing in commercial partnerships. And I think the key thing for women's sport is how do you bring it's got to be more than the sum of its parts. It's not only one channel that you need to focus on. You really need to focus on every single bit of communication, every single bit of every channel, and bring that together with one really solid message, one really solid call to action, and that will start to work harder for you. I think it's hard. I think, you know, sport has traditionally not always had to sell as hard as we do right now in women's sport. So really pulling together all of those opportunities are going to be really key. And I know the Super League are pulling in some great new partners, like how we're going to work with partners to really sort of drive visibility and engagement. And also that digital opportunity is huge. If you look at what's happening with TikTok in women's football, you know, that's not just something that shuts out, oh, it's just kids playing on TikTok. This is something really serious. This is where they are consuming their sport. So we really have to have proper strategies against those digital channels to make sure that we're absolutely making the most of that out of them. I'm sure the Super League have got loads of plans for next year to make sure they do that. So, right.
It's a tough world out there, though, because everybody's competing. So we're out of time, aren't we, Laura?
We are 10:02.
Can I just say that we're grateful to all organisations and influencers who helped make this report possible by by collaborating with us. And if you do have anything that help us continue to make these reports better, we'd love to hear from you. Please encourage your colleagues to head to the WST website to download the copy of the report. And don't forget the survey. We'd love to hear from you, and it helps us as a charity continue to do what we do. So thank you.